Thanks, John. Yeah, as John said, he and I actually started as soil conservation officers together in the same intake in Queensland DPI. And as I said to John earlier, look where we are now. So the topic is locust plagues. And the question that's been posed to me many times, particularly during the past season, are they a credible threat, or are they the kind of stuff that you write movie scripts from? Just a little bit of background to the Australian Plague Locust Commission to put this in context. We deal with 3 species of concern: the migratory locust, the spur-throated locust, and the Australian plague locust. Each of them have different areas of persistent and intermittent distribution, as shown there. The darker areas are the persistent habitat, and the lighter shaded areas are their intermittent habitat. The most significant of those that we deal with is obviously the Australian plague locust. And one of the reasons why it is a bit more significant than the other pests is because of its biology. It can produce 4 generations each season from spring to autumn, and so therefore can respond much more rapidly to favourable weather and vegetation conditions than the other 2 species can. Australian plague locust has a defined area of interest, and that defined area is established under the legal agreement that exists between the 5 governments, the Australian government and the 4 state governments that actually invest in the Australian Plague Locust Commission. So essentially I have 5 bosses. I think I've worked out which is my real boss, but I'm not about to tell him yet. To perform our mandated role, we actually have a series of field bases. So we have 3 field bases and a Canberra HQ. The field bases are populated with 9 field staff who their entire role is surveillance and control, whereas in Canberra we do a lot more in terms of research, etc. The Australian Plague Locust Commission is much more than control, and in fact over the past 10 years around about 20% of our budget has been spent on control. The rest of it is spent on forecasting, information delivery, and a lot of other functions as well. In addition to those 3 field bases in the Canberra HQ, we also have a network of light traps spread around Australia, and we also have 2 experimental insect monitoring radars that we run in conjunction with the Australian Defence Force Academy. And those light traps and radars are positioned to be able to give us the best coverage we can of the long distance and major migrations that occur, particularly with the Australian plague locust. We have a very clearly defined charter under that legal agreement, and just to again clarify what our role and responsibilities are, our role is to monitor and manage locust populations which pose a threat to agriculture in more than 1 state, and that's why there are 4 state governments that invest in us. We also provide assistance and support to the state agencies where they undertake regional locust control within a state, and we provide information to landholders to assist them in undertaking individual crop and pasture protection in the same way as they would do with other pests and diseases on their property, after taking into account the relative economic considerations of undertaking control. So let's turn to the 2010 plague, in particular spring 2010 and all the hype that went with that. There have been quite a lot of locust plagues over the past millennia, and recognising the Australian plague locust is a native insect, and it's been here for at least 3,000 years, and it has learnt to adapt very, very well to the Australian environment, which is how it can become such a significant pest. Locust plagues have been reasonably well documented over the past 75 years, and that's what we're seeing in this graph, is the scale of locust outbreak in the past 75 years. Scale 1 is where you have localised moderate to high density populations springing up in a few locations, but quite localised. Scale 5 is the kind of outbreak that we did have in spring 2010, so September, October 2010, where more than 500,000 hectares are affected by locust activity across several states and in moderate to high density. So that's a scale 5 outbreak, and that's certainly what we had in spring 2010. What's also interesting to look at is how these significant plague events correspond to La Nina events. Now, there's not 100% correlation, and we've been analysing this in more detail, but certainly what we are seeing is quite a strong correlation between La Nina events, particularly where they've been preceded by 4 or more years of drought. The Australian plague locust has this innate ability to be able to rapidly build up its numbers after it's been sitting in background during drought population in fairly isolated enclaves, and can then explode once the conditions are right. One of the tools that we use at APLC is satellite-based vegetation condition mapping. Some people might know it as NDVI, Normalised Differential Vegetation Index. This is the picture in October 2009. So what we're seeing there is that certainly the inland of Eastern Australia was reasonably dry, fairly sparse grassland vegetation. Remembering that the Australian plague locust, its natural habitat is grassland, and its preferred diet is grasses, which funnily enough include cereal grains. And so therefore, as we've expanded our cereal grain cropping areas further and further west, taking advantage of minimum and zero till, taking advantage of controlled traffic and all sorts of other things, plus the new varieties that we've got, what we've managed to do through clearing the vegetation and putting it under cereal grains is to massively expand the preferred habitat of the Australian plague locust. By the time we got through to December 2009, we're actually starting to see some of the effects of the rainfall from October, November 2009, and in particular, if you have a look at this channel country in southwest Queensland, northwest New South Wales, adjacent areas of South Australia, that was really starting to green up. And that's the kind of area where if locusts do go into a background persistence population during drought times, that's where they reside. That's where they hang about. And we were starting to see the conditions develop for the development of a more significant population. By April 2010, virtually the whole of inland Eastern Australia was quite green. Right, so we saw the vegetation really respond. We saw fairly significant areas of cereal grain and other crops planted, and so we saw a lot of vegetation there for the locusts to tap into. And that situation certainly persisted through winter, where even when we got into August, most of that inland Eastern Australia area, particularly as we got down south, that was very green. One of the points of biology of the Australian plague locust is that the 4th generation each season, so the late autumn generation, will almost always migrate southwards. As I said, they've learnt to read the climatic conditions probably better than many of us have. They move southwards with their last generation to put their eggs in the ground, which will overwinter and hatch in spring, in areas that are most likely to receive winter rainfall. That way, when the eggs hatch, the winter rainfall will have produced good spring vegetation for the young nymphs to be able to feast on. So they migrate southwards, and that's what we saw in April last year when we had massive swarms moving into areas of southern New South Wales, northern Victoria, even western Victoria and eastern South Australia. And they all emanated from a very large background population that existed throughout the central west, the southwest of Queensland and the northwest of New South Wales. And that population moved south and southwest. But it was a background population. It was low to moderate density. It was spread across very, very large areas. So if we knew that population was there, why didn't we do something about it? That area was all going to contribute fairly significant numbers that then moved south. Well, our mandate is intervention, not prophylaxis. We undertake control where there is high density infestation to manage the population. This is a native insect, and so therefore we can never really look at attempting eradication. We wouldn't want to anyway. So we managed the population through intervening between generations. We did actually intervene. We treated about 200,000 hectares in March last year in that northwestern New South Wales, southwestern Queensland corner. And if we hadn't have done that, our estimates are that there would have been an additional 8 billion plus locusts that would have moved into southern New South Wales, northern Victoria, eastern South Australia, half of which would have laid eggs. The other thing about this past season, which made it very interesting, was that the autumn temperatures stayed quite warm for quite a long time. The vegetation was certainly there to support the population. There were quite a few swarms that we observed staying and laying for up to 6 weeks, and those females laid up to 4 clutches of eggs. So we had a major multiplication, and we had the vegetation and climatic conditions down in this area persist through winter to give us everything in the right position to kick off with a big spring generation.